Today's subject is one of the most famous of all English elegies, Alfred Tennyson's In Memoriam, first published anonymously in 1850, and for a long time, Mark, one of the central poems of English literary culture. This was a really dominant elegy, wasn't it, in the English mind, a poem over which Queen Victoria pored, for example.
Yes, and it explores the varieties of possible elegy more exhaustively than any other poem has ever done. It's got 131 sections, plus a prologue and an epilogue, and in it you get Tennyson rehearsing, exploring, dramatising ways of communicating loss, experiencing loss, in a manner that seems obsessive, seems absolutely crazy, to be honest. That the pathology of it is absolutely fascinating. It connects with love and death more extremely, I think, than any other that we'll be examining in this series, simply because it doesn't really undertake the work of mourning. It simply explores new ways of being melancholy about the death of Arthur Henry Hallam, rather than looking to move forward. It does eventually, after 100 and so of the different poems, explore ways of moving forward, and it connects it to a marriage in Tennyson's own family. But Tennyson clearly experienced the death of his best friend with a kind of fullness that is almost unbelievable, given they'd known each other for 4 years. But it triggered in him so much poetry. I mean, not only In Memoriam, but other poems like Break, Break, Break and Ulysses and so on were all written in the wake of this really convulsive break in Tennyson's sense of his life.
So we should say something about the subject of the poem. It's called In Memoriam AHH, and AHH is Arthur Hallam, who was a contemporary of Tennyson's at Trinity College in Cambridge, and seems to have been the most charismatic and starry young man. He was at school, he was at Eton with Gladstone, and Gladstone said, late in life, that Hallam's death left a space that could never be filled, and that he brought to everything a touch of the ideal. Anyway, this young superstar died aged 22 to everyone's astonishment in Vienna in September 1833. What do you make of the presentation of Hallam in Memoriam? It's kind of a love poem, isn't it?
It is. Hallam is a hero in every single way, and he doesn't ever criticise Hallam. That the more the poem goes on, the more extravagant the praise of Hallam. So he does fit, I think, into a 19th century concept of the hero. Heroes and hero worship was a kind of Carlyle title, and it kind of culminates in Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch. But you certainly get figurations of the life that Hallam would have led. He had been a wonderful politician. He would have saved the world in various ways. If a new revolution had come along that was a good one, then he would have been at the forefront of it and would have been defending rights and making things work, that everything he touched sort of turned to gold in. So to an extent, clearly it is, on one level, an adolescent pash. That Tennyson was completely struck by this young man. They went on holiday together to the Pyrenees, and that holiday in 1830 was absolutely crucial kind of memory for Tennyson that he returned to late in life. But it was the moment in which somehow a Bloodbruderschaft, a kind of pact between them, was cemented, and it would have been cemented even more by the fact that Hallam was going to marry Tennyson's sister, Emily. So he would have been part of the Tennyson family. And in one of the poems, Tennyson imagines him being uncle to Hallam's and Emily's children. He takes them on his knee and pats them and would tell them bedtime stories. So there's a whole kind of other life which has been destroyed by Hallam's death. But we keep getting these perspectives into what he would have been like if he had survived. So it's one of those poems that is not only dramatising grief, but is also imaginatively drawn to lots of lives or events that didn't happen because of his premature death.
Tennyson said much later in life that Hallam was as near perfection as mortal man could be. So there is absolutely that sense of heroism that runs runs through the poem. And yet one of the great poignancies of the poem, isn't it, is the sense of Hallam becoming more and more and more unfamiliar to Tennyson. That one of the sections of the poem, he says he can't actually remember what Hallam looked like anymore when he tries to imagine what his face was. And one of the key words that recurs in the poem is the word strange, that Hallam has become estranged from him in some painful way. So there is a, as it were, a humanly scaled perspective to the poem as well as a heroic scale.
I think that's one of the cruxes for Tennyson in writing this poem, that the tradition of idealizing the beloved is obviously present in the poem, but Tennyson is always trying to defend Hallam's individuality, his particularity, his distinctiveness, and the notion that Hallam might, like a drop in the ocean, somehow become part of a general kind of sea of souls absolutely disturbs Tennyson, that he can't bear the thought that if Hallam is in the afterlife, that Tennyson is going to die and he's going to go up to heaven and going to meet Hallam and he's going to be as he was when they're at Cambridge together. So the notion that Tennyson might become a kind of angel or some kind of divine seraph and lose his individuality absolutely terrifies Tennyson. So I think it's an interesting moment in the history of the elegy in which the impulse to idealize and present the beloved as becoming, part of paradiso in some way and losing their distinctiveness is not comforting for Tennyson. In fact, the opposite. So it's always balancing the language of idealism or idealization, but also a sense of wanting to figure and almost dramatize the life that Hallam didn't get to lead in the poetry. So, bad luck, Hallam, you died, but this is what it would have been like if you hadn't.
We should also say, and I'm sure this is something we'll come back to in our conversation, that as a poem it is intensely self-conscious, isn't it, about its own position within the tradition of English elegy. So one of the poems that it thinks about a lot is a poem that we've talked about, Milton's Lycidas, that Tennyson held up as a absolute criterion of taste. He thought if you didn't like Lycidas, you didn't really like poetry at all. And there are all sorts of fascinating ways in which In Memoriam touches into the traditions of pastoral elegy that we talked about in our conversation about Lycidas, and other ways in which it feels that it can't take part in those traditions anymore. It has to do something modern which no longer joins up with those sorts of traditions. And to take up what you were just saying, it's also very mindful of things like Shelley's Elegy for Keats, isn't it? And one of the things that Shelley thinks is okay is that Keats has just been absorbed into the one. And as you say, that's not a consolation that Tennyson warms to at all.
No, and his nature, and the poem has some of the most beautiful writing about nature in the history of poetry, but his nature is not a sort of transcendental signifier, as it is in, say, Wordsworth. It doesn't lead to the divine. And that is also because Tennyson is responding to developments in science that are happening in the first half of the 18th century, and he's conscious, he knows about the dinosaurs, is one way of putting it. He knows about the dinosaurs, and he knows that what came to be canonized by kind of Darwin as evolution is more likely than that God created the world 2,000 years ago or whatever, as the story of Genesis has it. So the poem is poised between these quite archaic traditions of pastoral elegy and a kind of modernity which really struck a chord with the Victorian public. Because one of the most interesting aspects of the poem is it's intensely private, that it is a working out of a private obsession, psychosis, friendship, love, whatever you want to call it, that is completely deep-rooted in Tennyson and is fundamental to his being. His identification with Hallam, as presented in the poem, is complete. At the same time, it's a poem that was enormously popular, that Queen Victoria loved it. She said, after the Bible, In Memoriam is my habitual reading after the death of Albert, and it sold in truckloads, and the year it was published, 1850, was the year Tennyson became the poet laureate and was able to get married to his own Emily Selwood. So it was his breakthrough poem. But the paradox is that it had this vast public acclamation and connected with the Victorian populace's ideas of mourning and of grief and of poetry as well, what poetry should be like. but at the same time its sources are so deeply kind of private and occluded, and you really feel that Freud needs to get going on this poem and work out what's wrong with this guy. And I mean, Hamlet is one of the people who is gestured to in the poem, and the persona of speaking in memoriam has that kind of Hamlet-like meditative kind of mourning or melancholic qualities.
Yes, a figure of melancholia rather than a figure of effective mourning, as you said at the beginning of our talk. That's right. That sort of odd interface between the privacy of it and the kind of representative sort of public quality of it, that is something that Tennyson himself recognised, isn't it, I think? In that he does sometimes say things like, it's the cry of the whole human race rather than mine. And I think that, well, we'll come on in a moment or two to some of the early poems which begin in a very personal register. But by the time we get to the middle of the poem, he is taking on issues about all the things you've just been talking about, issues about developments in science and developments in metaphysical thinking and things like that are of a kind of generational or kind of epical kind of significance rather than just something that's happening to Mr. Tennyson.
And what's so odd is he's doing this through elegy, which, elegy is a very specific form, normally connected to a particular death, and has a function as a way of dealing with that death. But Tennyson's expansiveness pushes it into all different kinds of directions. So the range of configurations of the elegiac that In Memoriam presents, it is unrivaled in poetry in English.
Well, let's start, shall we, with an example of an early section. As you say, it's in 133 sections. One of the questions that critics used to worry about was whether it was a single poem or whether it was a sequence of individual lyric poems. I don't think anyone really seems to care very much about that question anymore. I think T.S. Eliot was probably right when he said that it does have a kind of a unity, but it's the unity of a diary. But I suppose one thing we should say about that is that the diary is absolutely fictional. The order of the poems as we read them isn't at all the order of the composition of the poems. I mean, Tennyson has constructed a kind of a ghostly kind of background narrative, hasn't he, to organise his poem very loosely, and it's organised around 3 Christmases, isn't it, roughly speaking?
Yes, and he wrote it over 17 years, and he started in 1833. And anyone who's interested in the composition of the poem, I recommend having a look at the Trinity College Cambridge website, which has the notebook, the Trinity notebook, in which he drafted sections of In Memoriam. Some of it has been sort of doctored or cut out, but there's a wonderful picture of Hallam weeping because he kind of did little kind of drawings as well of Hallam and kind of doodles in the margin. It's a really fascinating document that's beautifully presented on the Trinity College website, the Wren Library. So yes, he gives it this kind of temporal structure of the three Christmases, and in some ways, if you think of the poem as a quest, time is almost, he's the pilgrim moving through time towards some kind of potential resolution to his problems, and the 3 Christmases mark the ways in which time is elapsing. And yet he's always digressing. He's worse than Sterne in Tristram Shandy in terms of, you feel he's getting better. He says, yet again I return back. He goes, yet once more, O ye laurels, so to speak. He yet once more finds a new facet of Hallam to mourn, or a new bit of nature to regret that he's not there with Hallam to appreciate and get excited about. So the disenchantment, the flux between disenchantment and some sense of trying to get through the misery which is presented in images which are so resonantly desperate and deprived of all magic, disenchanted, is one of the kind of extremes which the poem presents. There is a kind of expressionist, sort of, proto-Plath style bleakness about a number of the vignettes which the poem presents.
Well, okay, let's have a look at section 2, because perhaps that's a good example of what you're talking about. I'll read out the first few lines of it, shall I, so that our listeners can get a sense of that use of landscape, that sort of psychological use of landscape that you're talking about and comparing, interestingly, there with Plath. So this is a graveyard scene. This clearly isn't Hallam's grave because he hasn't arrived back in England yet. But Tennyson has wandered out into a graveyard and is thinking about death and the entombment of the dead. Old yew, which graspest at the stones that name the underlying dead, thy fibres net the dreamless head, thy roots are wrapped about the bones. The seasons bring the flower again, and bring the firstling to the flock, and in the dusk of thee the clock beats out the little lives of men. O not for thee the glow, the bloom, who changest not in any gale, nor branding summer suns avail to touch thy 1,000 years of gloom. And gazing on thee, sullen tree, sick for thy stubborn hardihood, I seem to fail from out my blood, and grow incorporate into thee. It's an amazing use, isn't it, of the obdurate kind of unchangingness of the yew as a sort of symbol of numbness or non-responsiveness somehow.
Yes, paralysis, trauma. Tennyson is brilliant at capturing those states, and the loss of a sense of selfhood, which that final lines communicate. I seem to fail from out my blood and grow incorporate into thee. So it's almost a parody of the Romantic poet's identification with nature, in which you feel uplifted by seeing mountains and cataracts and so on. In this case, the yew's stubborn hardihood becomes an image of Tennyson's own frozen state and a sense of no moving forward. But what is so amazing is the image of the roots netting, wrapped about the bones, netting the dreamless head. And I think the kind of physicality of the poem is really interesting, that the remains of Hallam are much kind of thought about. His body's journey from Trieste back to England is charted in poem after poem, and they were among the first that Tennyson wrote. But the poem is poised between the spiritual and the material in a really interesting way, and to what extent nature can be seen as having its own laws, that it operates according to its own energies and urges, so to speak. That kind of evolutionary aspect of nature is in conflict with the idea of remembering or preserving of love, really. I mean, this poem really goes to the heart of our title, Love and Death, because it just conjugates the notion of love as a resistance to all the material processes which decay the body and let it moulder in the graveyard, like the ones in this poem.
Thanks for listening to this extract from Close Readings. You can listen to the full episode and all our other Close Readings series by signing up to our Close Readings subscription. Go to lrb.me/audio or click on the link in the description.